I think Final Fantasy X, especially for my age group, means a lot to people. This is the first in the series on the PlayStation 2. The production values for this game was some of the most impressive stuff seen in the JRPG genre at the time. When I was a kid, I cherished this game. Since then, I've gone back multiple times and I found myself being conflicted. The game is still my favorite in the series mostly because of nostalgia, but it has flaws that are hard to ignore. Even though the HD remaster has some flaws, I'm playing it for recording reasons. The game introduces us to Titus as a Blitzball player in Xanarkand. After picking a name for the protagonist, Titus walks to the Blitzball arena while a narrator describes his father. During the Blitzball game, the main antagonist of the story, Sin, is introduced, along with a future party member, Auron. After some tutorial battles, Titus is teleported to the land of Spira. Soon after coming to Spira, Titus meets Riku, another future party member. He again gets attacked by Sin and washes ashore by Besaid Village. As you can probably tell, this is the first Final Fantasy to be fully voiced. At the time of the original release, this was a pretty risky decision. Looking at it now, the voice acting itself is alright, but it can be disjointed at times. Sometimes the delivery is off, and there's a brief pause between each line. I'm assuming this is caused by each line of dialogue being loaded in one at a time. Scenes with more intensity suffer the worst from this. In this review, I'm going to avoid discussing the story. In short, even with its goofier moments, the main story is alright. Where Final Fantasy X shines is in its smaller scenes with only one or two characters. The party sets sail for Kilika. Sin attacks the ship and the first real boss fight begins. I say this because this is the first one to incorporate all of the characters' abilities. After completing the puzzle in Kilika, the crew is on its way to play a Blitzball game in Luca. After the game, Titus officially joins Yuna's crew. This is the point where the game really starts. From here on out, the game generally follows this formula. There's a long, distant road to the temple, a couple of bosses on the way through, there's one or two story sequences, then there's the puzzle at the temple itself, and then Yuna gets a new Aeon and the cycle repeats. After Luca, it becomes very apparent that the whole game is essentially a long hallway. I can only speculate as to why Square decided to do this, but I'd wager it'd have to do with the full 3D environments. In Final Fantasy 7 through 9, each screen outside a battle and the overworld contained a pre-rendered background. Previously, if the scene wanted to get a different angle on a character, a brand new CG render was required for each shot. Since most of the environments in Final Fantasy X are 3D, this allows for cutscenes to have many more dynamic camera angles. This makes cutscenes much more interesting to look at. The downside of the new environments is that the level design is extremely linear. In other entries, the game would have a fully explorable 3D world. In Final Fantasy X, it's been reduced to a long hallway. Final Fantasy X removes the ATB battle system seen in the majority of the games. With ATB in the previous series, the player would have a set amount of time to do an action. The new system, CTB, gives the player as much time as they need to make a decision. The future turn order can be viewed at any time as well. This new system bases its turn order on the speed stat. In short, faster characters and enemies will have more turns than slower ones. Abilities and spells can affect turn order. Because of this, haste and slow spell variants are incredibly powerful. With the new battle system, the player can switch out characters at any time. Each character has a specific role in battle. Wakka can damage flying enemies easier and has much more range. Titus has tons of speed for faster enemies and has slow, haste, and flee. Auron has high HP and damage output, he's basically the tank. Lulu is the black mage of the group. Yuna is the white mage that can summon Aeons. Riku's abilities are item-based with a mix of thief. Kimahri starts out in the middle of the sphere grid and the player can make him into whatever the character they want. Multiple times during a battle, I'd switch out a character with a scan ability to determine a weakness and switch back. Overall, the designers did a good job at making everyone useful, with the exception of Riku and Kimahri. Riku's abilities don't mesh well with battle. Other characters have specific advantages over enemies that make them worth bringing into random encounters. Riku's only advantage in battle is destroying Machina in a single hit. Problem is that there's a disproportionately smaller amount of Machina enemies in the game. As I said earlier, Kimahri's role is more of a blank slate. The problem with this is that he can become underpowered because of how the sphere grid works. In the original sphere grid, level locks are in the way of quickly building Kimahri's stats. Instead of each level having a direct increase in stats, Final Fantasy X introduces the sphere grid. During battles, party members will earn AP. After a certain amount of AP is earned, sphere levels are unlocked. One sphere level can advance the player's position in sphere grid one untraversed node. Each node can range from being blank to having a new ability unlocked. These nodes are activated with items called spheres earned from battle. What makes this new system unique is that characters can spill into other characters' sphere grids. For example, Kimahri starts in the middle and has access to everyone's sphere grid from the start. This makes leveling up very tedious because you have to go back to the menu and manually level up each individual character with each individual sphere level. Theoretically, it's possible to build any party member any way the player sees fits. The problem is that it requires an immense amount of grinding to do so. Each level only moves you one new space. Many of the most useful items to help with leveling are only found near the end of the game. If the player wanted to sidetrack 4 spaces to get an extra ability for Titus, 4 levels would need to be grinded out in battle. I can't help but feel this only discourages the player to get creative with their character builds. The advanced sphere grid tries to address these problems, but it only really removes the level locks between each character's grid. This time around, limit breaks are replaced with overdrives. By default, overdrive meters are filled by taking damage in battle. This can be changed by unlocking new modes. New modes can build overdrive meters in specific ways. This can range from evading enemy attacks to afflicting status ailments. The overdrive meter for each character are carried over from every battle. Once overdrives are used, a minigame determines how effective it is. Aeons have overdrives that follow this general rule set as well, but don't have a minigame tied to them. In addition, Aeons have abilities that significantly increase the amount of overdrive meter gained per hit. Riku's and Kimahri's overdrives are underdeveloped. Riku's Mix overdrive has players combining items for a random effect. Problem is that the players have no idea what combination of items does what. Riku has 64 different overdrives with hundreds of items combinations available. Finding them all in-game would be ridiculous. Kimahri's Ronso Rage overdrive has a similar problem. His Lancet ability absorbs overdrives from enemies and bosses found throughout the game. The player has no indication on what abilities Kimahri can absorb. The only upside is that Kimahri can learn most of these overdrives at a single fight near the end of the game. Because overdrive meters are kept after each battle, it's incredibly easy to save up your overdrives for boss battles. This can trivialize many of the game's boss fights. Every boss seems to have a particular gimmick to go along with the fight. For example, during the first encounter with Sin, the player can only use ranged attacks on him. This keeps boss fights interesting. The amount of variety in enemy encounters is incredibly low. Every enemy has at least one reskin at minimum. The worst offenders will have 5 or 6 skins. Throughout the whole game, you'll be fighting the same kinds of enemies, only with different color schemes. It doesn't help that most enemies die in a single hit or two. Bosses require much more strategy and fully take advantage of the battle system. Overall, the bosses are much more enjoyable to fight compared to the random encounters. More than halfway through Final Fantasy X, the game is still introducing new mechanics to the player. Aeon and equipment customization are held from the player until a little over the halfway point. Instead of equipment giving characters stat boosts, each weapon and armor has slots for abilities and stats. Essentially, items found can be crafted into new abilities. Placing them much earlier in the playthrough would have allowed the designers to add much more depth to these mechanics. Final Fantasy X has tons of great ideas. The battle system is quite fun when it requires to strategize, but most of the enemies die fairly quickly. The sphere grid could have been a great addition, but the amount of grinding required turns off most people. The visual design of the game is incredibly top-notch, but this is hampered by the weak delivery of some lines. All in all, Final Fantasy X is a good game, but it fails to utilize all of its mechanics. A little more fleshing out with the various systems could have made Final Fantasy X into a true classic.